I'm very pleased to introduce veteran business journalist John Gallagher. He joined the Detroit Free Press in 1987 to cover urban and economic redevelopment efforts in both Detroit and throughout Michigan. He was born in the New York City area, lived and worked in several major cities in the early part of his career, and he did a mid-career fellowship for business journalists at Columbia University, where he studied economics, finance, labor issues, and law, a broad spectrum for a business journalist to write about. When I was asked by the Haas Fine Arts Committee to do a class on Yamasaki, I immediately thought of John. A number of years ago, I served as communications director for the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, and John and I often worked together. If the subject is economic development, architecture, or Detroit's revitalization efforts, few are more qualified to talk or write about it than John Gallagher. After 30 years with the Detroit Free Press, John retired from the Free Press, but meanwhile, he has been turning out books as well as freelancing. His book, Yamasaki in Detroit, A Search for Serenity, which you see the cover, provides a biography of architect Yamasaki. John has also authored a number of other books, Reimagining Detroit, Opportunities for Redefining an American City, which was named by the Huffington Post as among the best social and political books of 2010. Other books include Great Architecture of Michigan, and he co-authored the AIA Detroit, the American Institute of Architects Guide to Detroit Architecture. He also, his most recent book has been The Englishman in Detroit, and in September, his newest book, Memoirs of a Rust Belt Journalist, I believe, unless it gets edited and changed, will be released. In 2017, he was inducted into the Michigan Journalism Hall of Fame, and John and his wife live along Detroit's East Riverfront. Welcome to John.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation, and hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here and look forward to your questions and comments and thoughts after we talk about Minoru Yamasaki for a bit. I believe Andre sent you all a list of Yamasaki's major buildings around the world, most notably, of course, the World Trade Center Twin Towers in New York City that were destroyed on 9/11. But he also did, he did a temple in Japan. He did an office tower in Spain. He did, an airport in Saudi Arabia and multiple other buildings, all over the country. Not as well known that he actually lived and was headquartered, was based in Detroit for the last 40 years of his life, and contributed numerous buildings in Southeast Michigan. If Albert Kahn is probably the most notable architect Detroit ever produced, I think Yamasaki runs a very close second, and especially for introducing a sort of a thoughtful modernism into the architecture of Michigan. So a very interesting guy. This cover you see, this is the cover of my book, published by Wayne State University Press in 2015. It's a biography of Yamasaki and appreciation of his work. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, about how you can see that. But here hang on a second. Whoop. Okay, there we go. Here's Minoru Yamasaki later in his career in a photograph by, I believe this is by Taro Yamasaki, his son, actually, who became a photographer. A lot of the most famous architects were based on the East Coast or the West Coast. It's a bit unusual for Yama to have settled in Detroit, but we'll talk about how that happened. So the question I want to address is today, who was he? How did he grow into the style that he developed, which is very thoughtful, very deliberate creation. It wasn't, it's not that he simply took the latest style and designed it that. He really thought very carefully about what he wanted to produce for people and managed to do that. And so how that developed. So let me start by saying he was born here in Seattle in 1912. His parents were Japanese immigrants. here he is as a toddler. The photograph makes them look fairly prosperous. They're actually quite poor. His father always had a couple of different jobs going. They lived in a cold water flat in Seattle for a time. Like a lot of immigrant families, they placed a huge emphasis on education as the key into the American dream. And like a lot of immigrant families, they placed enormous pressure on their oldest son, Minoru, to be the one to carry the family's dream of success in America forward. He went to college at University of Washington, studied architecture. From the beginning, that drive, as I said, there was this family pressure to sort of succeed. That drive was always there throughout his career. In the summers, he worked, since this was during the Great Depression that he's in college. In the summers, he got a job up in the Alaska salmon canneries, the fish canneries in Alaska. Did that for a few summers. Absolutely terrible working conditions, low pay, bad food, terrible, brutal bosses. I mean, unsanitary factories. And he took away from that. As I say in my book, most of us kind of forget our summer jobs in college the moment we leave them, but Yama never forgot how sort of dispiriting that was, and it made him realize he needed some basic human amenities, both as a human being and as a way to begin to work. So something as simple as clean, well-lighted environment, decent food, clean sheets at night, and sort of something that was a respite from the daily grind. Well, anyway, he graduates from college in the middle of the Great Depression, wants to start his career in architecture. So he goes to New York City, which then, and probably now, is the center of architecture. He got a bunch of different jobs that lasted temporarily. One was at the Empire State Building, which is already built, but he was doing kind of interior setups and that kind of stuff. And wherever he worked, the firms would write these glowing recommendations for him that, you did such a wonderful job. We're going to hire you back the moment we have more work for you. He also first studied and then taught watercoloring at Columbia University and elsewhere. Here's one of his watercolors. So very talented. And again, the same thing, the schools would say, we really loved the work you did for us. We want you to come back next semester if we can, have a program, if we can afford to hire you, we really want you to back. So even in his 20s, he was getting this reputation early as a very, very talented young designer and young architect. Well, World War II came along. He is in his late 20s, 30, 31-ish. He's Japanese American. We know what happened to Japanese Americans on the West Coast. They were put into internment camps, and Yama did face a lot of discrimination as a young Japanese American. People would sort of accost him on the New York City subways and grab him by the lapels and say, "What are you, a Jap spy?" or that kind of stuff. But at the same time, he was so manifestly talented that he was given the role of designing a naval training base in upstate New York. This is in the Finger Lakes district. And he was given total control over all the design and all the construction of all these buildings. He later said it was the best training he ever had for running his own firm one day. Here's a guy who just, again, is so manifestly talented that even in the middle of war, even when we were sort of locking up Japanese Americans, he's given this key sort of national security role. He comes back to New York when this is done later in the war. He's active politically. He's trying to get Japanese Americans out of the internment camps and relocated. And here he is speaking at a dinner of the Japanese American Relocation Society. And he's also designing housing in New York, including renovating existing buildings. And this is one of his sketches for a housing project in New York City. And if you look at this, you see two things. First, this is just freehand, charcoal sketch. So he's a wonderful sketch artist. You saw with the earlier watercolor, he just have a real facility with sketching and drawing. And also, if you notice the little stick figures of the people, which is with a simple line, he not only suggests a person, but also movement. You see the people on the lower left sort of walking. So again, just very, very talented. Well, at the end of the war, he's still in New York. In Detroit, the firm Smith Hinchman Grills was the oldest and leading architectural firm in Detroit, which had done all the landmark Detroit buildings in the 20s, the Guardian Building and the Penobscot Building, many others, really suffered a lot during the Depression, during the war years. At the end of the war, they wanted to get some of their design sort of reputation back, and they needed a new chief designer. And the word was there's this young guy in New York who's this really talented guy. So they recruited and hired Yamasaki to come to Detroit. And that's how he got here. Now, I think he probably thought, like a lot of people who move to a new city, I'll give this a couple of years and then I'll try something else. But he wound up settling here and spending the rest of his life here and designing all of his great buildings while here in Detroit. The first and most significant building he did was this modernist annex to the Federal Reserve Bank building in downtown Detroit. On the lower left, the sort of the three-story kind of classical bank building, that's the Federal Reserve Annex or Federal Reserve Bank building. This is where the Federal Reserve keeps cash that comes in and out of banks. And in the late 40s, they needed more office space, and they hired Smith Hinchman, and Yama got the job of designing it. And so he designed the middle building, which is the modernist tower that's set back a little bit. And this is the first modernist building in downtown Detroit. And it was enormously influential. Every building, every new sort of major building in downtown after this is designed in this modernist idiom. Most important, if you'll see how the building is set back from the sidewalk about 30 feet, this was central to Yama's belief that, again, taking those lessons he learned, in college, in the Depression, in the fish cannery, his love of nature, that you have to give people some sort of little oasis so that they could get out of the hustle and bustle and have just a little outdoor seating area where they could just kind of chill out a little bit and feel human. Now, as it turns out, I used to work in this building. The Detroit Free Press moved into this building, pardon me, about 10 years ago. And even though that little setback doesn't look like much, just to sit there at the benches in that little area, it's just so serene and so delightful. You're in the city, but not of the city for a moment. You can kind of watch the world go by on the sidewalk while you have a nice little seating area. And this became central to his architecture, and all of his buildings included these little oases of places to get out of the hustle and bustle. Well, he really was kind of ambitious and felt a little stifled at Smith Hinchman. Even as chief designer, he felt he didn't have enough control over his work. So within a few years, he moves on. Pardon me. This time of year, moves on, starts his own firm in Detroit, and is doing all kinds of smaller projects. This is a dental office in the city of Detroit. Again, nice little modernist building. There's a wonderful home up in the Palmer Woods district in Detroit. Here, you see, does a lot of schools. This is Grosse Pointe North. You can see the done in the modernist idiom. The original school, built in the 1920s, has that sort of Independence Hall, Mount Vernon sort of classical look. This is what Yama did them. Very serene, very, very efficient, very functional. And this is the American Concrete Institute office building in Detroit. And this is actually very, very Yama-esque in that you see first, he loves this sort of off-white or white sort of concrete look. It's, precast concrete. You notice the diamond pattern on the roof line. He really liked that Gothic arch, the diamond pattern, which he liked both structurally and also sort of as an art element. You notice how he sets the building up a little bit, so you step up to it, sort of sets it on a pedestal a little bit. And his use of materials is very interesting. On the side of the building, you see that sort of grill work. That's simply pipe that were cut off and arranged to create that sort of grill pattern. So very interesting structure. Now, he had a partner who was based in St. Louis and who had a very lot of connections. And very early on, Yama got two major projects in St. Louis. One was Lambert Airport, the airfield, and this is Yama's design for Lambert Field, built in the 1950s when he's still only in his 30s. And you can see how he designs this so that these enormous concrete shells come down to rest on just these little points. And you notice there's one in the background. This was sort of what was called a metabolist school, as a metabolism is Japanese school that you would design something and then just add on, just replicate it going forward as needed. So you'd have a sort of organic growth as you need it. And you see that Yama's buildings photograph just beautifully. I mean, all of his best buildings really photograph beautifully. The other project, and let me just add about Lambert Field. If you have to go back to the 1950s, early 60s, when the jet age is just starting, and there was the feeling that aviation and the jet age represented the future. This is when, if you took an airplane flight, the men wore suits, the women wore dresses and pearls, and to take a flight was really an exciting thing, sort of a step into the future. And a lot of the airports, like Dulles Airport in Washington, designed by Aero Saarinen, and Saarinen's TWA terminal at JFK in New York, a lot of the airports were designed with this futuristic look because that represented the jet age. And Yama is sort of working in that idiom. Less successful, he designed the infamous Pruitt-Igoe public housing project in St. Louis. And there he is with some of his partners in the model. This was one of the first of the big post-World War II public housing projects. And the housing authorities that commissioned this project wanted a very dense community that is, packed in as many units as they could. Yama disagreed and told them that they should have low-rise buildings. And he wrote at the time, man is a ground animal. He needs to live near the grass and trees to feel human. So again, expressing that connection to nature that he had. But the client, the housing authorities, really wanted this super dense, high-rise community. So he did it. It never worked well. It was never maintained well. After only about a quarter century, the whole thing was imploded, demolished. And it's generally viewed as an object lesson in how not to do public housing. So I think Yama was right in his initial reaction, but he later said this was the worst mistake of his career, this whole project. Well, at this point, he's in his mid-30s, getting on to 40. As you probably know, architects come into their own usually only in middle age and sometimes in old age. Frank Lloyd Wright designed his famous Falling Water house, the one over the waterfall, in his mid-60s, and the Guggenheim Museum in New York in his mid-80s. And Frank Gehry today, still probably the world's leading architect, is well into his 80s, if not his 90s by this point. So Yama is searching in his 30s into his early 40s for what style he wanted to do, how he wanted to design buildings. And this is what he learned in college, this kind of thing. This is the Palace of Fine Arts, Palais des Beaux-Arts in France. This is what he was taught as kind of the ideal. But he said, and one way we understand Yamasaki is that he wrote voluminously throughout his life. diaries, magazine articles, interviews, a biography, biographical work later. He wrote a lot, and he wrote that he and the other students in college all thought this kind of thing was kind of false. All this elaborate decoration, he thought, was not really authentic to what the building was. What he and the other students preferred was this, the Bauhaus in Germany, the famous art colony, art school, very stripped down glass and steel and ceramics, no ornamentation whatsoever. And his ideal, his favorite architect, his personal favorite was Mies van der Rohe, doing this kind of thing, these sort of glass houses, steel and glass. But at the same time, he thought that this sort of thing, this is the Lever House in New York City, the first of the great international style or glass box skyscrapers in New York City. He thought this was not the end of architecture. He thought that this is a way station on the way to something, that modernism had further to go than this, even though most architects thought this was sort of the end. I mean, the ruling orthodoxy in architecture in the 50s and 60s was this kind of thing. And so Yama is searching for what he wants to express. And about the age of 40, he's in the hospital with, he suffered, unfortunately, from a lot of health problems throughout his life, bleeding ulcers and that kind of thing. When he gets out, he's got a commission in Japan. So he's going to take some time and go to Japan for this commission, and then travel and see some of the world's great architecture and see what he can learn. So first in Japan, he sees the tea houses, and he's just blown away by how beautiful these Japanese tea houses are. And he writes that, you can leave a bustling street and you walk into a tea house and everything is serene and perfect. And then you walk out into the garden in the back, and it's as if every leaf and petal is placed there by the hand of God. So he was very, very impressed with this. He goes to India and sees the Taj Mahal. And again, he's just stunned by not only how beautiful the building is, how intricate it is, but by the whole landscape. You notice this little water feature running up to it, and the landscapes on either side. And he understands that the entire environment is part of the bit. It's not just the building, it's the entire environment. Then he goes to Europe and he sees these great Gothic cathedrals. And again, he's so impressed with the silhouette on the skyline and the way the sunlight and shadow plays across the face of the cathedral. So he comes home and he wants to put all this together. And the first place he has a chance to do it is at Wayne State University, with what's called the McGregor Memorial Conference Center, donated by the McGregor family, the McGregor Fund. And this is his first really great work, and his first work that really expresses what Yamasaki is all about. So again, you see in this beautiful photo by Balthazar Korab, again, he sets the building up on this sort of pedestal for some stage setting. Notice how the water feature and the sculpture garden and the landscaping is an intricate part of the whole design. The building itself only occupies about half the total site. The building is fairly simple. It's sort of two wings connected by the central atrium, but unlike most office building atriums, which are simply the lobby that goes up to the ceiling, this atrium runs the entire length of the building, and the skylighting, if you will, of these diamond-shaped patterns. So once again, he really likes that kind of the diamond-shaped or Gothic arch, both structurally and as a design element. And again, with the landscaping, the water features, the sculpture, all of this is his way of creating this oasis where people can get out of the hustle and bustle and sit. Sorry, let me go back for a minute. So again, people who have gone to Wayne State and spent a lot of time there tell me they would sometimes just come here and sit here just to get, just to chill, just to relax a little bit. And it's still a beautiful building. After it was built, the water feature had some problems. It was drained, and for a long time, It was just sort of an empty concrete bowl, sort of unsightly. But a number of years ago, Wayne State did the right thing and spent a lot of money to restore the water feature. And this is how it looks again today. And it's absolutely one of the best buildings in Detroit, one of the most serene environments in the city. Yama had developed by this time a mantra of serenity, surprise, and delight. That's what he wanted to give to his clients: serenity, surprise, and delight. If you remember, the European theorist Le Corbusier came up with this famous phrase that a building was a machine for living. And that is about as far from what Yamasaki was doing. He was not interested in doing machines. He was interested in doing these very humanistic places where people could actually feel their humanity, just relax and understand, and from that take away energy to go on with their lives. Next great building out in Southfield, Michigan. This is an office building, just a suburban office building, the Reynolds Metals or Reynolds Aluminum office building. And you see a lot of the features that Yama became known for. The building is set up on a pedestal. It's got this beautiful water feature. The screen around this one is aluminum, as you might expect, with Reynolds Metals, Reynolds Aluminum. And once again, the entire environment is what's important, and his buildings, again, in a photo by Balthazar Korab, his buildings just photographed, just beautifully. Now, there have been probably 10 million suburban office buildings built since then, and in some ways, many of them mimic this. Beautiful atrium, some attempt at landscaping. Almost none of them achieve kind of the serenity that Yama achieves here. Now, unfortunately, this building was abandoned by Reynolds. It became a Vic Tanny workout center for a while. It's been closed and boarded up for a number of years. The water feature has been filled in, and it looks pretty sad at the moment. So it really illustrates that, there were some architects where you have to buy the whole program to get what they were getting at. Yama is obviously one of those. Frank Lloyd Wright, probably the most famous one. If you buy a Frank Lloyd Wright home, you don't touch a thing. You just take it exactly as Frank Lloyd Wright designed the home and the furniture. But Yama's that same way too. You really have to see what he was doing with the entire site to get the sense of what Yama was trying to create. Well, here's another building at Wayne State. This is DeRoy Auditorium, just a delightful small auditorium. It also has a water feature. You can't see it too well here. This also was, the water was drained here by Wayne State, but they're in the process of restoring this one too. So I think they understand what they have with Yamasaki. This is one Woodward office tower, originally the Michigan Gas Company office tower, office headquarters, now known as One Woodward. And some see this as a precursor to the World Trade Center, although he didn't, he hadn't heard of the World Trade Center project by this time, but this is his first tall building. But even here, you notice in the front with the plantings and the little area in front, he tries to create these little seating areas, outdoor seating areas where he can. This is the lobby of it. You note the ceiling, those aluminum cross hatches and the little blue flame light bulbs that's supposed to mimic the pilot light on a stove, since this is the gas company building. He worked very, very hard to get the exact shade of blue and the exact type of aluminum, and to make this area as pristine as possible. Again, since that time, Dan Gilbert and his Bedrock Real Estate now own this building, and they've added a lot of furniture and artwork to the lobby. I actually prefer this. I think, again, you have to sort of take Yama, whole cloth to see what he was doing. This is an office, an insurance company in Minneapolis. And this is, again, the kind of thing he was doing. This became known as in the trade as new formalism. It was a phrase that came about in the early 60s for what this kind of thing is. Formalism, as in taking inspiration maybe from the classical architecture with the columns and so on, and the regularity, of the design, but new, obviously new. And it was really not a compliment. It was really more, the term new formalism became more of a put down actually for Yama and a few other architects. So he was rather controversial. People thought that, he should have simply been, continuing the tradition of the glass box, the international style, and not do these other elements to it. And he became known to some as a decorator, or someone who did wallpaper, who would take the glass box and put kind of a screen around it. I think that criticism, in my view, is not valid. I think that you have to be in a Yama building to feel how serene they are, how the total environment works. My co-author on the AIA Detroit guidebook, Eric Hill, an architect, studied in Boston and had learned that criticism of Yama, that there's really not much to it. And then he came to work in Detroit and saw buildings like the McGregor Center and understood just how perfect they were. And so his opinion changed totally. Again, it's the total environment he's getting at. A turning point came in the early 60s. This is the Seattle World's Fair. And Yama was asked to design the US Pavilion, the Science Pavilion at the World's Fair in Seattle in the early 60s. And he designed the buildings as well as the water feature and these little fountains and this sort of unusual ethereal sort of entrance feature. And the Port Authority in New York and New Jersey at that point was thinking of designing this massive new office complex in Lower Manhattan. And they sent one of their executives out to Seattle to look at the World's Fair and see if they could figure out, get some ideas of who's doing what in architecture. And this man saw this building and just was stunned by how beautiful he thought Yama's work was. And so they offered Yama the job of designing the World Trade Center. And at first he said he couldn't do it. His firm was too small. He only had about 40 people. This was as you know, just the most massive office complex, ever built in New York. It's supposed to be the world's tallest building at the time, but they really pursued him and they got him. And here's a photograph that they released in the early 60s showing Yama at his desk, and in the background, the image of the One Woodward Gas Company building. And this is the sort of publicity photo they put out when they announced that Minoru Yamasaki was going to design the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center towers. Well, this is the project that, of course, became not only famous, but infamous in many ways. It occupied 10 years of Yama's work. It took him from about the age of 50 into his 60s, and really was very, very controversial for a lot of reasons. It covers 16 acres of Lower Manhattan that was cleared out. Yama, by the way, was famous for his model making. He had one of the most advanced model making operations at his firm of any firm at the time. Here he is with these gargantuan models of the World Trade Center. There were at one point his office had a drop ceiling and had to take the panels out so that the models could reach up to the ceiling. Then it was built eventually and became very controversial. People thought they were too tall and out of place in Lower Manhattan, out of place on the skyline. They just really stuck out. People thought they were kind of featureless and so on. And Yama did not totally disagree. I mean, he had urged the Port Authority not to do these two super tall, 100-story plus buildings to be the tallest buildings in the world. He said that won't last very long. Something else will come along. And of course, within a year or two, the Sears Tower in Chicago had exceeded these anyway. He suggested a series of smaller and slimmer buildings around the site. But the Port Authority insisted on having 10 million square feet of office space in the two buildings and, the tallest buildings in the world. So this is what emerged, and he was roundly criticized by architecture critics, although he did do a number of engineering advances here that he thought were really important. For one, the elevator towers, instead of having elevators go from, the lobby to the top floor. He did a series of local and express elevators. You can see in they go up about a third of the way and then 2/3 of the way up, and you take them to one, to one of the sort of upper, excuse me. You take an elevator to one of the upper lobbies and get off and then take a local the rest of the way. And that freed up a lot of space. You didn't have to have as much space devoted to elevator cores. And that freed up a lot of office space. He also, in the foundation for the building, the big problem, this is right along the Hudson River, and the water pressure, once they dig the hole, several stories down into the ground, the water pressure along the side will collapse the hole and flood the hole. So in order to prevent that, they did something called a slurry wall, which was kind of a real innovation at the time, where they dug down just a 30-foot section, put down a framework, poured the concrete in there, or put in slurry down in there, slurry, a mix of sort of gravel and water, pumped concrete into that, and the slurry kind of drains out and the concrete sets, and you have one 30-foot section of the wall. And then you go to the one right next to it and do another one and do that around the whole length of the wall. And that way they could do it without having too much water pressure at any one point. And after 9/11, when the buildings came down and you saw the big hole in the ground where the towers had been, that was basically the wall that they constructed to build them in the first place. And that wall held even after 9/11. That wall held against the water pressure from the Hudson's River. And finally, the exterior kind of grill work on the side of the building. It's not just decorative, but most skyscrapers, because skyscrapers tend to sway in the wind at the top. In some cases, several feet. I mean, a very, very tall building will actually sway in the wind. And to prevent that, architects will design this bracing on the inside of the building, cross hatching that runs up the whole building and kind of braces the building, but it takes up a lot of space. And so Yama designed this exterior grillwork to be the framework that would hold the building in place so it wouldn't sway. So that and the elevator court and so on, all that added about 1 million square feet of office space that the Port Authority was delighted to have, because they could rent it out. So he did all these engineering innovations, but that wasn't enough to sway critics of the building. People still thought these were terribly out of place. And Yama never quite lived this down. Some say it made him and destroyed him. It certainly changed his practice. He suddenly was now doing skyscrapers everywhere. He was on the cover of Time magazine, one of the few architects to get that. He gets invited to the White House. He meets President Johnson, and he's designing all over the world at this point. This is a banknote from Saudi Arabia, where he designed this airport, and they were so delighted with his work, they put his airport on their currency. And he's designing skyscrapers all over the world. This is a building in Seattle, an office tower known colloquially as the golf tee building, because it looks sort of like a golf tee to some. Century Towers in Los Angeles, which I think actually work pretty well. I'm generally not as big a fan of Yama's skyscrapers, as I'll talk about in a moment, but I think this one works pretty well. And I did a couple more bank buildings. This one, as I remember, is in Buffalo, and this one in Minneapolis. But again, one thing that most people would say about Yama is that these tall buildings don't work as well as his shorter buildings. So as an example, here's a university library, Butler University in Indiana. And to me, this is, just works better than those tall buildings like this. I think this is much more expressive of what Yama is, that mantra of serenity, surprise, and delight, and a place where the total environment can be part of the project. I just find this much closer to what Yama was doing. But the problem was he became so famous that he was getting all these mega projects around the world. But even though he's designing all over the world, he's still doing projects locally here in Detroit. This is a home that he built for he and his wife in the early 70s up in Bloomfield Township, I think, Bloomfield Hills or Bloomfield Township. And again, very serene, sort of a return to the Mies van der Rohe glass houses with all the landscaping involved. Open floor plan, really, really delightful. Yama, as I mentioned briefly, had in many ways kind of a troubled life. He suffered from illness much of his life. He was married. They suffered a lot of discrimination to Japanese Americans. When they moved to Detroit, they wanted to buy a home in one of the upscale communities like Grosse Pointe. The realtors refused to sell it to them because they were Japanese American. So he bought an old farmhouse in Troy and lived there for 25 years and raised their family there. And later sold it at some enormous profit when Troy began to develop. So he had kind of the last laugh there. But after 25 years of marriage, he and his wife, Terry, divorced. He had a couple of very short-term marriages, which didn't work very well. And then he and Terry reunited and remarried and were together the last 15 years of their life. So again, sort of an unusual personal life, but this is the home he designed for them. And they lived here the rest of their life after he passed in 1986. She lived there the rest of her life. It was published or purchased some years ago by a designer who had it restored completely. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful place. And this is Temple Bethel on Telegraph Road in Oakland County in Detroit. This is one of his last projects. The Forum is meant to evoke the tents that the Israelites lived in after they fled Egypt and lived in the desert. And again, you take away from this, how experimental Yama could be structurally, that you have this enormous concrete structure that comes down and rests on a few of these points around the edge. You also notice the windows that run all along the base, again, because connection with nature was so important to him, that he wanted people to see out and people on the outside to see in. He wanted that sort of seamless connection with nature. He also does a really interesting trick here with seating, because most religious buildings have this issue where they get a certain number of people who come on an ordinary service day, and then on high holy days, they get a much bigger crowd. So where do you put people? And a lot of people will put the overflow crowd in the basement and use closed circuit TV or something like that. But Yama created these side aisles that you see in the photo, the the central aisle, but then the two side aisles. And he made them wide enough that you could set up extra seating on the high holy days in the Jewish calendar, and then remove them when you didn't need them. So kind of a neat trick for the way he did this. And once again, a photo by Balthazar Korab. You see how beautifully Yama's buildings photographed. So even toward the end of his life, in his early 70s, he's working here in Detroit and still experimenting with form and expression. He works until the very end. He dies of cancer in 1986. When I think about his legacy, first, and he just has a lot of beautiful buildings in Detroit and elsewhere that are still there with these beautiful environments like at the McGregor Center. But beyond the actual buildings, the notion that any major building needs to include the entire environment as part of its design, whether landscaping, whether a sculpture garden, whether water feature, a plaza, or something like that a public building is not just the building itself, but as part of the total environment, and that we need to consider buildings not as a machine for living, as Le Corbusier said, but as a human environment where you want people to feel their humanity. That is now so much part of our architectural DNA that we don't necessarily attribute it to Minoru Yamasaki, but he was certainly one of the ones that really fought for that in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I think it's really an important part of his legacy. And so with that, let me just add that my biography, Yamasaki in Detroit, A Search for Serenity, published by Wayne State University Press, is available. You can find it on Amazon. If anyone ever runs into me, I'd be happy to sign it for you, but you can find that book there, order it to local bookstores. And at that, I would be happy to have Amy or Andre come back and begin to take your questions and comments.
Everyone, I just want to let you know I am monitoring chat. So if anybody would like to enter any questions in the chat, you may. You could also unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question over the speaker. I will mute people. If two people start talking, I'll mute one of you. So go from there.
Well, as the coordinator, I'm going to ask a question.
Okay.
And that's McGregor Conference Center. Yamasaki also built two adjoining buildings, the DeRoy Auditorium, I believe, and the Hillberry.
He did 4 buildings on Wayne State's campus. McGregor was the first. The education building, which is sort of across the way from McGregor, he did DeRoy Auditorium, and he did the business school too, which is right next to DeRoy Auditorium. He also importantly did a campus plan when, if you happen to know Wayne State University, 2nd Avenue in Detroit used to run straight through the heart of the campus. And if you see the original photos of the McGregor Center, it's right next to a road and there's cars parked on the street and cars buzzing by. And he suggested to Wayne State that they close 2nd Avenue and make the entire stretch of the campus an enclosed mall with the buildings sort of on either side of the mall. And Wayne State did that and managed to create this very serene, enclosed campus environment because of that. So when people come visit Wayne State, they a lot of times they'll know, oh, Yamasaki, he did the education building, or DeRoy or McGregor. They don't understand he's also responsible for the basic look of the campus. And again, it was that search for serenity. How do we make things sort of as much of an oasis as we can? And that's what, so he had a major impact on Wayne State.
What did he feel about building this whole complex that was just a block and a half or 2 blocks away from Woodward Avenue, which is the main artery?
It's funny. Earlier I showed an image of a home he built up in Palmer Woods 7 in Woodward. One of his early homes from the 50s, and it's a fairly good size home with a good size lot that it's on, and with a beautiful fence around it. And when you're there in the yard, you have no idea that you're about a block from Woodward Avenue. It is this beautiful, serene environment. You can sit there with the trees, and so on, and this beautiful modernist house right there. And you have no idea that there's traffic whizzing by, a couple of 100 yards away. He did that kind of work. I mean, he's built, as I said, at the Federal Reserve Annex in Detroit, even though the setback's only 30 feet and the sidewalk's seemingly right there. When you sit there in that little recessed area, it's just a delightful place to get out of the hustle and bustle. So that was one of his trademarks. And I think that's what the critics of Yamasaki didn't really understand, because they didn't really visit his buildings. They mostly saw photographs. But you have to sort of be in his buildings to understand how serene and how perfect they are.
We have a couple questions about Yamasaki's personal life. Were any of his family interred during World War II? And then his activism after World War II to get justice for the individuals that were interred, where did that lead him politically?
Sure. He didn't have any immediate family members. He did get his parents to come east to avoid that. And for a while, they had this apartment where they had about 6 or 8 people living like a one-bedroom apartment in New York. After the war, he got so busy architecturally, he had to let some of the political stuff go. So, after the war, he was no longer as politically active as he had been during the war.
We also have a question about his children. You mentioned one child went on to be a photographer. Did anybody else take up architecture?
He had one son, Kim, who was not an architect, but he worked for the firm as kind of an administrator for a while. His son Taro became a photographer for the Detroit Free Press, actually my newspaper. He and I just missed each other. He left just before I got there, but he actually won the Pulitzer Prize in 1986, I believe it was, for his photographs. He did two projects. One of I think it was Southwestern High School, all the kids at Southwestern High School, and also I think it was Jackson Prison. So Taro became very successful, and he's still out there doing work. And they had a daughter, and the daughter became an artist and an educator, and she passed not too long ago. So we had three kids, all of them very successful.
Would you say there's any currently working architects that are influenced by him, and any works that we can look at today that are being built that are influenced by him?
Well, I think partly, well, you don't see kind of the new formalism work that he, if you want to use that term, I don't think you see that anymore. I do think you see, the question of people adding plazas and landscaping and so on to buildings. I think that's totally accepted everywhere. Often not as well as he did it. As I mentioned, that I don't have a photo to show you today, but that Reynolds aluminum building in Southfield, if you saw the lobby there, in one sense, it's skylighted, open air, very modernist, very clean and efficient. And you say, well, this looks like the lobby of a suburban office building, without realizing this is the first time it was done, So I think a lot of what he taught has been absorbed into the architectural DNA, just as a lot of what Frank Lloyd Wright did, popularizing things like the picture window in a home, a big formal window. That's been absorbed. You don't necessarily say this was Yamasaki or Wright or whoever. So nobody's working in his exact style, but I think certainly some of the lessons that he taught are now, as I say, part of the architectural DNA.
You mentioned that there was actually critiques at the architecture schools after the World Trade Centers. How is he currently taught at architecture schools? Is there good opinions about him? Is he one of the architectural leaders? How is it generally received?
That's a really good point. I think that generally he and Eero Saarinen and some others who were criticized a lot for departing from the kind of the standard orthodoxy of the international style, they are much more appreciated now. Saarinen especially, I think Yama too, but Saarinen especially, with his TWA terminal in New York City, the famous one that looks like an eagle taking off, and some of his other buildings. These people who are considered either, too expressionistic in their buildings, too experimental, too whatever, I think we really appreciate their work. For Saarinen, the GM Tech Center in Warren, just an amazing environment. And in fact, GM, of course, has added to that tech center many times over the years. The eastern half of it is all new. Doesn't compare with what Saarinen himself did. And, Yama's best work, I think, holds up, even though the newer buildings on Wayne State campus don't compare with Yama's work, even though they might somehow try to, add, a seating area or whatever outside. I mean, I think Yama's work stands alone. So I think they're much more appreciated today than they were at the time. Let me just add one benefit of writing about Yamasaki, as I said, is that he wrote voluminously throughout his life, letters, diaries, whatever. And his papers were collected and stored at Wayne State, at the Reuther Library at Wayne State. They have, if I recall, about 40 boxes of his personal papers, which was invaluable when I was doing his biography. And he did magazine interviews. I mean, he was always out there talking about his work at the end of his life, he did a sort of a compendium of his best work with about a 20-page autobiographical statement called A Life in Architecture. And it's in there that he writes about this summer job at the salmon canneries in Alaska, and he devotes an enormous amount of space to the lessons he learned there, kind of the humanistic lessons he learned as a counterexample to the drudgery of that life in the salmon canneries. So he expressed himself throughout his life in many different ways. Let me just finally add that despite, you know, there's sort of the architectural hierarchy tended to criticize people like Yama and Serenity. At the same time, he was world famous. He was getting commissions all over the world. I mean, his personal papers are filled with invitations to, you know, jury this or design here or receive this award or whatever. You know, letters from some other famous architects, maybe like Philip Johnson, who was also criticized a lot, saying how much they appreciated his work. So at the same time that he was criticized, he was also, you know, just, you know, world famous and you know, received a lot of attaboys in his life too.
Well, that features nicely with our last question from the chat, which was, what did Yamasaki express a favorite of his?
No, not that I know of. I think that you know, he was sort of design it and then he'd move on like a lot of people do. They you know, he was so active to the very end, he didn't look back. I would think McGregor would have to rank very high in his in my estimation. That's my favorite of his buildings, but I never saw anything he wrote. I never saw him say this is my favorite.
Excellent. Okay, any last questions that anybody wants to put into the chat? Any last questions of anybody who'd like to come off of mute? I think those are some good ones. Andre, I'm going to throw it back to you.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we sure can.
Okay, the McGregor building, the interior is as lovely as the exterior, and how he's used the geometric shapes that are on the outside and how they show inside, and then the marble and the colors. There's a lot of community meetings that are held at McGregor, and you would see periodically the changes of the use of color inside the building. And I wondered if Yamasaki's firm had some influence on that, or was that the university?
Oh no, it'd be Yama's firm, Yama himself. I mean, he was the guiding light at his firm. One of his partners told me once, he said Yama ran the firm with, I forget, he said sort of a velvet iron hand. I mean, it was definitely his firm and his design ideas that he wanted to express. Although he also would go to every member of the team, whatever you were working on, and make them feel like part of it. He would go up to the guy doing the air conditioning and saying, you know, you two are designing this building. You've got to make this the best air conditioning duct that you have possible. And he would sometimes commission artists to do things like the doors. The doors at McGregor have this grill work, this diamond-shaped grill work that mimics the diamond-shaped work on the ceiling. So that was all Yama's vision. In terms of how he handled materials, there's a really interesting story at the One Woodward office tower, the gas company office tower in Detroit. He really liked precast concrete, which of course is the concrete you pour into a mold, and you can do designs or whatever you want in it. And you can add aggregate, which is little bits of stone to give it some color and texture. Well, he experimented and he found that the little bits of stone he was adding were very angular. We're talking about tiny bits of stone, but very angular, and that rainwater would perch on those and attract dust. And so the building would get dirtier faster over the years, some gasoline fumes or whatever. And so before they added the aggregate to the precast concrete, he tumbled in drums to round off these angular surfaces of these little bits of stone so that rainwater would roll off more quickly and the building would stay cleaner longer. And that's an example of how he was just so dedicated to working with materials and understanding his materials and what they could do and what they couldn't do. So I think that yeah, when you see a building like McGregor, it's Yama's vision that you're seeing.
The Michigan, what was National Bank, which is now I think Michigan One, on Woodward, and it has the sidewalk has the same thing that Holland has, which is the heated sidewalks. And I wondered, has that been used with any of the other buildings that he built?
Well, that actually wasn't him. If you're talking about the National Bank in Detroit Tower, that was someone else. And I don't know about heated sidewalks if he did that anywhere. So I can't answer that one. But excuse me.
Well, when I put together the list of a number of his projects, and my husband saw that he had done so many, 250, and for a person who isn't really familiar with construction, my husband asked, was he responsible for all of those? And I didn't know how to explain to him about, that you have partners and you have team members. Could you explain, we have a little bit of time, could you explain how an architectural firm works on projects?
Sure. Well, that list, by the way, he did all of them except the last 4 or 5. He died in 1986, and there's a few on there that were just because the firm survived him for a while. Finally went out of business. Some guy bought it and kind of ran it into the ground, and it went out of business about excuse me, maybe in the early 2000s or so. And then one of the very, very junior employees bought the naming rights, and so there's still a firm called Yamasaki, although it's sort of a third cousin. It's not really a successor firm. It's more like a second or third cousin to the original. Well, architectural firms work in different ways. Smith Inchman Grills, the first place he worked at in Detroit, is this enormous firm with multiple divisions, and they have designers, they have project managers, they have engineers. Albert Kahn, Albert Kahn was one of the first to include engineering services with his architectural firm. His brother Julius Kahn, it was the one who perfected reinforced concrete, and so when Albert was designing all of Henry Ford's factories, it was Julius's reinforced concrete that allowed them to build these enormous factories. At Yama's firm, he was the guiding light. And as I said, one of his longtime associates said that, Yama was the one who ran the firm with the, whatever it was, the velvet iron hand. If he had other people working on projects with him, but it would be his vision. So, Frank Lloyd Wright, had other people working with him, but it was Wright's vision. And Saarinen, the same thing. Both father and son, Eliel Saarinen at Cranbrook and Eero Saarinen at his projects. There are some architects that really have the vision, and they're the ones who do the most unique work. Whereas a firm like, Smith Inchman, even though they do really wonderful work, now called the Smith Group, they do all these hospitals and so on. They're very nice work, but they look sort of generic. They look like any one of a dozen major firms doing this kind of work could design that building. Whereas with Yama, you get buildings that look like Yamasaki, and that's really his vision. Now as I said, he had team members who would design, the engineering and the air conditioning and work on some of the details with them, but it was his vision for what they were going to do. Can't hear you, Andre.
Are there any other questions? Well, I'm sure last summer we did a tour of Detroit projects. Of course, it's in a 2-day period. It's very hard to get them all in. But I'm sure there's going to be requests now to go to drive by, or at least to go and walk through the Serenity of the McGregor building.
Well, the nice thing about Wayne State is you can see 4 of his buildings in a short walk. I mean, they're only McGregor and the education building are across from each other, and then you walk about maybe 150 yards, and you have DeRoy and the business school basically side by side, and you take that walk on the central, what's called the Gullen Mall. Gullen was one of the Wayne State presidents. They named it for it, but the mall that Yama created is right there. So you can see it all right there. To see the rest of the stuff, you have to get out and about more, but you can do the Wayne State stuff in a really tight time frame. So yeah, I would urge people to do that. I think you'll be really, really pleased.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your information. It makes me want to go back. You certainly have a wealth of information on what's going on in Detroit now and the redevelopment. And I'd like to entertain in the future sometime if you would consider coming back and talk about some of the newer developments. I'd appreciate it.
I'd be happy to. There's so much has happened in Detroit. Beginning about the year 2000 or so is when the city really started to turn around. We had this relentless downward spiral from the 50s on, when everything seemed to be going wrong and there was no relief at all. But beginning in the early 2000s, we began to see progress on multiple fronts, including, new housing being built and entrepreneurship, entrepreneurs building new companies and the Riverwalk was built, the amazing Detroit Riverwalk, which is beautiful. The city went through its bankruptcy, but now has one of the best credit ratings of any city anywhere. I mean, it's just, Detroit has really advanced very, very far in 20 years and a pretty exciting place, actually. So yeah, it's definitely worth another visit.
Thank you. And the audience, I can't see the audience, but I know that they're clapping. And we really appreciate having you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. It's my pleasure. And, call again. Happy to do another one.
I will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure thing. Bye-bye.